Okay, I think we're live, and today we're going to talk about web components. Some people will probably say, "Oh, web components again." Some people will say, "Oh, something new happened to web components." so I'm going to be doing this with Michael Warren. He was just there on Twitter defending web components, and I figured we should talk because the way that I'm going to say it is that. Um, I don't know if you noticed that, but like with accessibility, um, people who like push for accessibility, there's this kind of like a I don't know stereotype that's like they're only yelling, they're never kind of like helpful, right? And with web components, a lot of people who are kind of like web components, they use web components, they're either like using them quietly and never hear of them, or they're like you all are wrong. You're not doing anything correctly. So it's not even worth my time to like talk to you. so you strike as a guy who's actually like a bit more moderate. So yeah, if you have like a few seconds to introduce yourself and like how you got here.
Sure. Like you said, my name is Michael. Nice to be here. It's great to have you to be on and talk about web components. I'll talk about web components sort of anywhere, anytime. I think they're awesome, and I hope you're right. I hope that I do sort of come across as a more moderate sort of web component advocate because I do think that it's important to be sort of advocates of something, but not detractors of something else. And so the first thing that I'll start this sort of chat and this talk by saying is like, React is fine. React is awesome. Like it's a great thing. Like nobody has to be enemies. The UI frameworks and the web components are supposed to work together. They're not supposed to be fighting, kind of thing. They're supposed to be sort of complementary, I think. And so I'll say the same thing about I have used React. I've used Next.js, and they're both fine. They're fine. They're great. They have their purpose. And so if there's anything to take away from the a chat about web components, I think it's that they're supposed to be partners. They're supposed to be interoperable. They're not supposed to be enemies necessarily, right?
okay, that sounds great. I think that's like a good place to start with, right? So it's like we're not enemies. Let's figure it out. So I think the big and you kind of like talk about that before, like the kind of like the marketing mismatch and whatnot, right? It's like the big thing about web components is that everyone has their own ideas of like what web components are. So I'm just curious, like how do you define it? Like how do you usually like talk about it, or like how do you
Sure.
use it? Even, right?
So a little bit of background. So I've been a design system developer for the last several years, 5 or 6 years or so, and probably longer than that. And I've built component libraries that didn't quite get to be design systems; they were sort of just component libraries in Angular 1, in Vue, and then here recently in Stencil and both and in Lit. And so um, I think the story of web components is very complicated and very for a lot of reasons. I think the main ideas for the spec appeared a long time ago, 2016, 2015, way far back, right? And that's when we say 2015, that's kind of like the when React was first coming out type thing, like those kinds of frameworks, React and Vue first coming out. And but the problem is that they were sort of just ideas and just spec explainers, and browsers didn't adopt the specs that we commonly sort of are refer to as what web components became until 2020. And so I think there was a lot of time where folks maybe were talking about what web components could be, but you couldn't use them in any browser because like all the browsers had not implemented all of the specs, and so you couldn't actually do them. There were libraries, like Polymer that would create like polyfilled custom element type libraries and things like that. So I think part of it, at least, is that there was a huge lag between the idea and the cross-browser implementation being available. And in that time, in that sort of 5 years or so, we saw an absolute explosion of what we would call sort of modern UI frameworks. In the same amount of time that it's taken for sort of the web component idea to evolve and then be implemented and become cross-browser, you've seen React and Vue and Solid and Svelte and and lots of these things sort of come across, and lots of new features inside of those, and several major versions. Um, and so I think that's at least part of the story, is that it has taken a long time for web components to become viable, but they've been being talked about and maybe marketed and evangelized well before that, which probably wasn't a good thing. And so, but I think the cool part is that since 2020-ish, we've had the ability to sort of cross-browser make web components, make custom elements, and make some of those choices. And from the web component side of the house, it's been interesting to see which of those really popular frameworks have sort of adopted support for them and sort of come along and have sort of kept up with those things, and which ones haven't. You know, and I think there's always choices that those framework authors make as to what they support and why. That's based off of usage and popularity and all of those things. But I think the history of web components, I think, is definitely wrapped up in the fact that it took so long to go from idea to usable, that there was a lot of time for things to go wrong in the marketing and the approach and the explainer and the conceptualization and all of those things.
Yeah. So for that, the interesting part is, I guess. So what it was the year that you said that like the web components are kind of like done?
I think it was 2020.
Uh-huh.
I think 2020 was when I think Edge. It was either Edge or Firefox that finally got um, some of the last specs. I forget exactly what it was, but I know 2020 is the year that sticks out in my mind as when they sort of finally became kind of viable, and you could finally like reliably cross browser sort of build on them.
Right. So web components as like a web technology that's like available everywhere, kind of like ES modules, right? It's like everyone was playing or like emulating the ES modules, but now you can actually like ship them and you can like
Exactly.
compile
Yeah, and
anything
there are
from.
libraries that existed that were similar, making component libraries that were sort of polyfilling like custom elements,
Uh-huh.
but they weren't actually available cross browser. I think until 2020.
So speaking of like polyfills, do you think that like do you need to polyfill web components like in 2024?
I think it depends, and again, there's lots of choices here, and I think that's another one of those things that we always run into, is that it's a mismatch of expectations. The web components were designed to be a very low level spec. They were designed to have people build on them, but not necessarily be the end state. So the hooks that you get, right? The class lifecycle hooks of connected callback, disconnected callback, attribute change, all of those things, right? Those are really really low level, and that sort of ties into a complaint that people have a lot, is that just native raw web components are kind of hard to use. That's true. That's I'm not going to argue with that. Like that's true. The But they weren't really designed to be the end all be all API. They were designed to be a low level primitive that you built on top of. You know, Shadow DOM itself is not something. It's something that you build on top of. Slots are something that you build on top of. It's not the final API, right? So it's probably still it's going to evolve, and I think that there will probably be APIs that exist that have better developer experience than connected callback, disconnected callback, right? But at the same time, if you look at like framework components and the class based ones, it's kind of similar to what some of those components were doing. The on mount and component will mount and component did not. It's kind of the same kind of hook, right? It's the same kind of life cycle. So in some respects, it's not unheard of that those would get made that way, and it's sort of a low level kind of way. But I do think that people, either by the marketing approach or by just their own sort of absorption of the material that was available, right, like the MDN articles and blogs and things like that, sort of just got the wrong idea that web components were going to be like a more top level, high level API that's already been smoothed over, and not the low level one that they got. And so there's definitely a disconnect there for sure.
Yeah, I actually want to kind of like unpack this one because I was like trying to find it was just through going through that like thing, right? Where it's like, well, the way that it was marketed was not exactly the way that it kind of like ended up being, right? And I was like trying to find like the early marketing and like the early ways of how people were trying to sell it. And this was definitely like one big point that kind of got my attention is web components were intended to be like a low level primitive that frameworks will use, so that if every framework is using web components and not like reinventing their own kind of like, well again, like it depends on like how much we think that like web components do, right? But like as a framework, as a React, as Vue, and so on, right? I can take some of the things, and this is what's happening right now with like a spec for signals, right? They're like, hey, we as frameworks, all of us are using signals. If the signals were a spec, then maybe we can like implement them so that, well, the same way as like add event listener is a spec, right? So like everyone can talk add event listener, and if you like implement it like on the phone, you can use kind of like web standards and like get like another target, right? And if everyone talks the same signal spec, well, maybe kind of like state in Vue can trigger like update in Solid and so on, right? Or
Hmm.
Angular or React. I think that like you can also have like signals, right? And the same way, the same kind of like talking point was there for web components, right? If all that you do as a web framework is you name a thing and that thing can take props, right, and render something, we can take that thing, make it a spec, and make it so that like different frameworks can kind of like talk to each other, right?
Sure.
And like somewhat that uh, there's like some proofs that kind of like that happened, but I would argue that, like none of that happened, right? Uh,
Right.
React didn't throw any part of React so that they can replace it with web components now. Vue didn't take anything out so that they can use web components now, right? Everything has to do with web components is an additional thing that they added on top of their frameworks. They didn't take anything out of the framework. And
Yeah.
like is that true? Is that like a good way of reading
I think
it?
so. And like, and I'm going to sort of use another one that sort of is sort of orthogonal to web components and to talk about that. In React, I think the biggest one is synthetic events. React still has a
Well, again,
synthetic
like
event
biggest for
system.
who? I saw you arguing in Twitter, right? It's like, yeah, but bundle sizes. Like, we don't care about bundle sizes in React. What are you talking about, right? Like
Sure.
they don't
Right.
see that as a
Yeah.
problem.
And well, sure. And I just mean like that. I think what you're sort of bringing up is that there are there's lots of things at play in the complexity of the front end dev space. Like one is that specs move slowly, but the things that get made as a result of that specking process live forever. The things that go into HTML and CSS and JavaScript are going to be there for 50 years. They're going to be there for literally ever. And so that's why they go slow. It's because they want to consider all of these edge cases to make things go slow. Everything in user land, right? All the frameworks, all the stuff built on top of those things, they go fast. They always go fast, and they will always go faster than the specs. And so, coming from design system land, that's kind of how design systems work, right? The design system component team who's making all of the buttons for the company and all of the alerts for the company, all of the date pickers, they go slow so that product teams can go fast. And if product team says, I need a special different date picker that does this weird thing, I'm just going to go make it. Okay, go make the thing. That's cool. That's totally cool. Tell us what you learn, and then we'll fold it into the spec thing later on, right? I think so. I think you need both parts. You need the spec that goes slowly and stable. That because I think one of the beautiful things about the web is that it just hasn't broken in 40 years. Now that's probably something that we can all argue about because we can argue about everything on Twitter because that's fun, right? But it the marquee tag still works today, and I think that's just evidence that just things just don't break. and things don't get taken out. Now that's like, you could say that's a good thing or a bad thing because browsers keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger because they're supporting, ever increasingly harder to read specs. But the fact of the matter is they go slow, but the things live forever. Frameworks don't. Libraries don't. They're like the JavaScript that we're writing in our apps today will not be here in 5 years, probably. We will probably kill it and rewrite something else, right? Something else will come along. And I definitely think that you need both. For a successful community, you need the move fast, break things, try new ideas. Then you need to take those ideas and fold them back into specs. And so I love that you mentioned signals. I think that's what's happening in signals. It's happening with observables. It's happening with lots of different things, right? I think where it's not happening is components. And I'm sort of sad about that. I'm kind of sad about that because I do think that there's like a definite lack of involvement of some of the framework folks. I don't know why. I wasn't there. Like I'm a member of the community group now, but I wasn't, 5 years ago. I think folks have sort of felt like that maybe they couldn't or didn't want to, or it wasn't worth it to participate. But I don't think that we see on the component side of things. I don't think we see the people in user land and framework land driving the specs, and they might be the ones that are in the best position to drive the specs, right? And so I would love if that were the case. I would love if the framework teams would come to the web components community groups and talk to implementers and say, we've been doing this forever and people really, really like it. Put it into the browser, and get that ball rolling. Again, I think part of the disconnect is that ball is a very slowly rolling ball.
Well, I
It takes
actually brought this
months and
up.
years to do it, right?
Yeah, I actually brought this up because I think I'm like a very skeptical that this thing will work out with like observables and signals. Like my worry is that what it will end up being is that every framework will still keep the same signal implementation that they have in house,
Yep.
but there will be like an additional adapter that like turns them into spec, right? So like if you want to like talk between component between maybe like some DOM APIs, which again like don't exist yet, or like some other framework, right? There will be kind of like adapter, and you see that with signals that you have in Solid or in Svelte and RxJS, for example. Like those frameworks will have utility, kind of like from observer to observer, right? But like they're not going to use RxJS internally. That's like seems completely kind of like unfeasible, right? And one thing that I think kind of like happened with web components is that this promise of like we will take the thing that you all guys have in common, and we will make it like a no longer concern for you. And I think that like didn't play out. And
Yeah.
I'm just curious, like, would you agree with
I'm not
that? Do
sure.
you think that
Yeah, I'm
there's
not
like
sure.
still it will happen but later, or
Yeah, maybe. So I think that would be the hope. If on the surface, if when you look at framework components, a lot of there's a lot of similarities, right? You pass props in, you have state inside, you re-render when things change. You have a styling mechanism that you use. But there's lots of similarities. I think where framework components have sort of surpassed web components are in the SSR space, which is something that is is a constant comment. Every time anybody talks about web components on Twitter, the very first comment is, "But what about SSR?" Right? Like every time. And so I think there's two things to unpack there. One is like the question of why haven't frameworks adopted web components?
and will they
It,
ever?
and will they ever? I don't know. And I think part of the reason is that they sort of are inventing their own things, and they want to keep pushing the boundaries on that, right? The hope is at least they will consider web components when they make their new features, which is kind of a tricky thing to do too. Um, I think it might just be up to the framework, and they have other things to think about. So, for example, like if we go back to the synthetic events model, React probably doesn't necessarily need a synthetic event system anymore because the browser has events, and those events are really good and they're fine. They do the exact same thing. Why hasn't React sort of taken out their synthetic event system? Maybe it's really hard. Maybe it's really embedded and it's just really difficult. Maybe it would be a rewrite that they don't want to do. That kind of stuff. Maybe it would break how they are internally structured or something. I'm not sure. Um, And so I think there's all kinds of reasons for it. I'm not going to attribute it to like malice because I've been on large enterprise teams before, and sometimes it's sort of easier to just like we're not going to write all million lines of this today, right?
Right.
To pull out the anecdotes. I I do think that it is probably possible. I think another thing is that whatever happened along the way, and I wasn't present for it, sort of drove the framework folks out of spec land, has maybe made the paths diverge a bit, where maybe now they can't. Maybe now the paths aren't very close together anymore. Maybe they're sort of getting farther apart. I would love to see them come back together again, you know. But like I said, I think it's going to take framework sort of teams' involvement in the spec process to bring them closer together, so that they work on the ideas together instead of apart a little more for these kind of foundational things. Another part of it too is when you like your question of like the promise of web components being that you can just that the frameworks don't need to make their component systems anymore. I think another complexity in that is that our definition of what a component is has kind of changed, and in a big way, because think about before Angular, like there weren't any components. You didn't have jQuery components, and you didn't have whatever libraries, those kind of components in the same way that we do now. We, when all of these things were kicking off, even in like class-based React, you still didn't really have the same concept of components like you do now, right? I still think it wasn't as pervasive.
In what sense?
In that, so for example, when you build a framework app, this is all of them, right? A component in that application is just literally anytime you need any shared state, shared styles. It's like a code organization tool. So literally everything is a component. The entire app, like the wrapper div that's the app, is also a component, right? It's not reusable, so it's not a component because you're going to use the app component somewhere else in your app. So it's that everything is componentized. The entire app is componentized, and the definition of what we sort of use for components now is that's just the way you make stuff. It isn't that components are reusable all the time, because a lot of them aren't, right? A lot of the components, like especially at the top of the tree, those are the least reusable components, but they're still components for some reason. Like if you think of your like app.tsx or whatever in a React app, are you ever
Why
going to
did you say that it was different for class components and hooks based ones? It's like, wouldn't that be exactly the same? Like why are you making distinction there?
I guess it's like how people sort of talk about it. And again, I wasn't a React user in components
I was React user
in class land.
before they have class components, so
Okay, yeah. So maybe it goes as far back as that. Um, what I'm sort of talking about is like in the era of create React app existing and generators and things where everything is a component. We've sort of like, and that has become the de facto way to build apps. Maybe it started when SPA started. Like that's when sort of everything as a component became the kind of way to build stuff. Where we sort of left the componentization for reusability and for shared logic kind of a little bit beside, because when we just said like, oh, this one component per file kind of idea, or in Vue, or the multiple components, or a component is just a function, and so you can it becomes like a code organization tool. It becomes less of a reusability concern and encapsulating things like style and state, and more of a code tool of I just want to separate out these two divs from each other,
yeah.
and
Actually,
div one.tsx and div two.tsx, even though they're not going to be reused anywhere. That it's just that's like my form on this page and my different form on this page that are not going to be used in any other pages. They're still components.
Yeah,
right?
actually, I have kind of like two comments on this. So first is that I think just like to put a name on the thing. In React, you have kind of like create root, right? That's like
Mm-hmm.
where your kind of like application starts, right? I was using React when it was like a very kind of like old web, like Rails and all that stuff, where you would have more than one root on the page. So the idea that was that like when Facebook used React, they didn't have create root at the top of the application. They had a bunch of like buttons on the somewhere on the page, right? So like each of them was a new React component, like React 3, right, and all that stuff. And like you can still see that today. If you go to React DevTools, you see that like each root is there as a list. It's like it's even the DevTools, they don't expect you to have just one root like that. That's a bit crazy, right? But I think that's like that's a thing that I want to kind of like go back because I think that explains a bit like how kind of like web components can like diverge from framework components. But the other thing is, again, like React specific is for styles. React was never a thing to manage your styles, right? Because it kind of like by default, they were just like thinking that you just have app.css and you will figure it out. React does not have like any sort of like first party integration with styles, right? Which is again like another way where kind of like web components and like React in particular, right, kind of like diverged, but where all the kind of like more template based frameworks, they were like, oh yeah, like if you have a component that like you should care about style, that's like the most important thing. That's what web components
Sure.
do.
Sure, of course. And I think that's one, like, I think there's, to me, the two biggest reasons to make a component are encapsulated styles and encapsulated state, local state. Those are the two biggest reasons, right? Um, and I think that's still true today. And I think what you said is spot on, that React doesn't have a first party style. Like, they don't deal with styles. You deal with styles in React apps with other libraries, with styled components or CSS modules or vanilla extract or sprinkles or whatever you want to do, like build time, CSS, whatever, Tailwind, whatever it is, right? Another interesting aspect is that all of those apps they're still doing style encapsulation. They're just faking it with class names and data attributes and stuff. Like they're trying to do it, but it's not in my opinion, it's not actually real encapsulation. And I'll tell you why. But when you're using the approach of just hashing out a class name, let's say you have two different apps, like a micro front end or something, that are both using hash class names, and they're both on the same page at the same time. Theoretically, it is possible for two of those hash styles to conflict, right? If they happen to have the same hash somehow.
Right, which is like if you
It
have
would be
indeed
super
the
rare,
same
like
hash,
super rare,
everything will
right?
blow up. So like
Super
I
rare,
don't
but
understand how that's
technically possible, right? Technically possible. And I think that it might, you might think of it as like a pointless distinction, but I think the fact that it can possibly happen means that it's not actually encapsulated.
Yeah, just make it longer, the hash longer, right? It
Sure,
feels
yeah,
like a
add
good.
another one. Sure, yeah. And at a certain point, it's like, okay, maybe this can't ever happen. But Shadow DOM, it can't happen.
Right.
Like, it is a browser restriction. It may not, and the browser is making sure that it can't happen, not just whatever algorithm is in your CSS, class name mangling code, right? And so I think that's interesting that all of the framework applications have some sort of style scoping in them, but all of them are kind of like decently fair approximations of what encapsulation kind of means, right? Encapsulation doesn't mean the style can't ever get out and can't ever get in. It just means that it mostly can't, right? It mostly can't, right? Which is good enough most of the time. Like 99% of the time, it's good enough, right? But I think Shadow DOM represents true encapsulation, real encapsulation at the browser level. Like, a browser won't let you do it, right? Kind of thing, except for inherited properties in CSS.
Yeah. Well, actually, I want to kind of like go a bit deeper on that. It is my kind of like I don't know, my point that is like where I'm upset with web components. Like, if only we didn't have web components, like the life would have been easier, right? The the thing that happened is that when we were asking for style isolation 10 years ago, everyone would answer Shadow DOM, and we would say, no, we don't need that. But web components, like, we were like, yes, you would have to use that. right? And now finally that damage is getting healed, and we are getting actual CSS scoped, kind of like I don't remember like the exact name, right? But
At
like
scope
scoped
in
CSS,
CSS, the at scope, yeah, yeah.
right? So like now we're actually getting the thing that we asked for, but we are getting it 10 years later just because we did
Sure.
this like a whole sidetrack with the shadow row,
I think
shadow
this is
clone,
another one of those mismatch kinds of things, right? And again,
right?
I was not there. I don't know how the spec sort of originated. My impression of it is that web components, the spec, and the type of isolation and encapsulation that happens was mainly sort of suited for third-party components that came in that nobody controls, right? Because I think we can all hopefully agree that if you pull a component off somewhere on the internet, you don't want the possibility of that component screwing up your entire application with a weird global style, right? I think we can all agree that if you pull a non-headless, and again, headless components didn't exist, right? Nobody knew about headless components. So I'm going to sort of like put them aside for the time being. But I think we can hopefully all agree that if you pull a component off somewhere off the internet, some random library, it would be a good thing if those component styles could not affect your app, because that problem has happened for years. You pull a component, it's global styles, and then oops, overwrote all my stuff. All my layout is just busted because somebody's class name over here was bad, right? Um, I think that that's the model that web components were spec'd under, is more towards third-party components that the app developers are pulling in that they don't control. And that's where you get the walled garden. That's another reason why I say our definition of how like the most we use components mostly as components we write ourselves for our own apps that we do control. We don't use as many third-party components and things as much, right? And the ones that we do use, especially in certain frameworks and certain libraries, they're headless or whatever, that you still want that control from the outside, right? And so I think that's that's another one of these misconceptions, is that the spec and the isolation is really, really good for like third-party components that you don't own, then don't control. It's really good for them to make their styles encapsulated, so there's absolutely no possible way that their styles in that component could possibly break anything in your app. I think that's fantastic. That's just not what we do anymore. Like that's not we don't like we use things like ShadCN or MUI or whatever that are designed to be kind of headless. You bring your own styles, like that kind of stuff. We don't use as many fully fledged components that have their own style that we're happy with, that we don't need to touch and don't want to, right? Now, another little side note is I think there's some hopefully good news on that front, is that the browser maintainers and the web community group and us web components enthusiasts are aware of this issue, right? There have been lots of talks there, and there's some work going on right now that we call it open stylable right now, and it's a big messy topic, but the idea is, can we add to the web component spec to make a version of Shadow DOM that will let styles get in but not let styles get out? And I think that is sort of like the one style encapsulation, I think, mistake that web components made in the spec. Again, I don't know why. I wasn't part of it. If they had designed it originally that styles could get in but they just couldn't get out, they would be exactly like framework components. They would literally be exactly like it. I think that's the major problem, is that styles can't get in. I think everybody loves that styles can't get out. That's probably, hopefully, we can all agree that it's really good that styles in Shadow DOM don't get out. It's debatably bad that styles can't get in, because if you're building a React app for yourself and you can't make web components with that use your Tailwind up here at the very top in the global, like global link space or whatever. You can. It just takes 3 lines of JavaScript. But anyway,
Well, I guess
if they had done that from the spec from the beginning, I think the landscape of today would be vastly different. But it's not going unnoticed that there is this big ask, and like as a member of the web components community group, like please come help us figure this out. It's a big messy topic, like theming and also like the ability for styles to get in is a huge thing. If that landed, maybe that does change the landscape of what framework components could do, right?
yeah.
Because now you're whittling down the differences between framework components, and maybe the differences are just SSI, right?
Yeah, I think like uh, I think like de facto, like how web components work is that they are like the way that I think at some point it kind of clicked in my mind, like this is what web components are, and like it's like, oh, now I know how I can use them. Because like every few years I'm like, okay, what's happening in web component land? Can I use it for anything? No. Okay. A few years have passed, can I use it for anything? And it's like finally it kind of like clicked to me when I was like the author of like the third party thing that like you insert in your website, and it's like, oh, so this is just like a fancier iframe. This is like instead of having and like iframe, I think analogy is like very good because it's like all of your security is like crazy. All of your events are crazy, and it's like with all of that stuff, right? But it's a bit less like crazy than iframe, and it's like you have a bit more control and all that stuff. So I
Sure.
think that can like help me, and like this idea of like, well, if I'm building like a widget, I don't want like this is like the kind of like the leaf component, right? So like I want this thing to look exactly the same as it's like on the other website, right? But like the only thing that you can do is like maybe pass me a prop, and I will like change my style based on that. But that's the only kind of like customization that you can do, right? And this is very similar to kind of like how you embed like YouTube iframe, right? Like you
Hmm.
have a few things that you can configure to like the parameters, right? You can say allow full screen, like show title, like show UI, and all that stuff, right? But mostly it's just like, well, whatever YouTube decides that they should be rendering, that's what they render. I can't kind of like control anything,
Sure.
right?
And like, so I that triggered something in my mind about the whole like how the spec came about. Um, the video element, I think, is a perfect example of what we're talking about,
Yeah,
because I remember reading, and again, this has been years now, and I
yeah,
probably could not find the article, but I remember reading some of the GitHub threads about that browsers have been doing shadow roots for a long time.
yeah.
They've been doing
Before,
shadow roots internally since like audio and video elements came out, and even the like the input element has a shadow root. If you can actually go in Chrome DevTools now, and you can say turn on internal shadow roots, and you can see that input has a drop down now, like the native input tag, right, has for like type number or whatever, right? Like the arrows that go up and down for you to do like a step transition for an input type number, that's
yeah,
all in Shadowroot. That's all in internal browser Shadowroot that we don't have access to and won't ever have access to.
yeah.
But
Or
it's actually
color
like a
picker.
Shadowroot.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
it's
it's
a different mode, but it's the exact same idea. And the spec kind of came about of was it came from the idea of what if we exposed this Shadowroot to HTML so that people could create their own HTML elements with this separate DOM and do the same thing that the browser has been doing already for years, but sort of been hidden under the cover. And so you said that you hit the nail around the head. It kind of is like a simpler iframe. There's some other differences, like it's not sandboxed, and it's not like a different document. It's just a different tree, and you can style a web component's host element that's its custom tag from inside of the styles, which is kind of cool. We typically sort of when we're making the as web component authors, we typically say not to do that a whole lot because technically the outside world, the application sort of owns that tag, and any styles that you were to put on that from inside could get overwritten very easily from the outside because styles on the host have a lower specificity than anything else, and so they would just be easily overwritten. So we tried not to, but you can, and I don't think iframes can style the iframe tag from inside. So subtle differences, but I think you're right. The other point you made is that everything we always say as component advocates is that they are amazing for design systems and component libraries. When you want a component that needs to be the same, like everywhere, except give me a prop for a different color, give me a prop for a size, give me a slot for an icon or something. But the accessibility is all wrapped in, the state is wrapped in, the template is wrapped in, all of that stuff. I think web components, as is right now today, with almost no changes, make a ton of sense. Again, it depends on the choices that you're going to want to make, right? if you want your design system to be headless because you have 55 different brands and you want all of your brand folks to be able to style them however they want to without doing it via props, then it might not be the right approach. But if you have a couple of brands enough that you can do, color equal blue, color equal red, bad props, but don't do it that way. But they make a lot of sense because then you can encapsulate all of those things, and you get to decide as the author, like to what level they are encapsulated. You get to decide how it all works and what your props are and what's allowed versus disallowed and what is configurable and what isn't and all of those things.
Yeah,
Like
I think this
design
is
systems really
where
shine.
we probably disagree the most. I actually hate web components as a UI libraries, but that's this is how it was like sold to me, and this is what I was trying every few years and seeing that it like doesn't work for me. And it's like, well, why do you think that this is a valid use case? Like, I don't understand how to use it. And when I stopped believing that the web components can solve that, that's when it made sense to me.
Sure. And I guess it depends on what you mean by your sort of UI library. So if you are, and I think it depends on where you come from in terms of your background and your experience with other things. If you are used to a component being base styles that you are supposed to add to, and the component really is behavior and logic, right? And static accessibility things, then yeah, you're going to have a bad time with a web component. It's going to be really hard to throw your styles in there. Again, depending on how the author of that component chose to write it. If you're used to a sort of more like a bootstrap style kind of thing, right? Like bootstrap would make perfect sense as design system sort of components in, because you're not really wasting time on changing the border radius of all the buttons. So you can, right? But most people who use sort of bootstrap didn't do that. They sort of just kept it exactly like it
Well,
was
just because
and
it
just changed the
didn't
color,
work,
right?
right? They tried, it didn't work, they gave up, and that's why every bootstrap looked the same, right? And that's the same thing for like web components. If you want to use web components in a thing that's like basically kind of like not configurable, sure, that's the only way that you can use them.
Well, it's not configurable. It's configurable via props, right? And or via custom properties, the CSS properties. So it's not configurable. It's just not infinitely configurable. It's not like, and to some extent, what the value of that component is become sort of limited to its logic and its template. And so if that's all you need from it, then web components might not be a good fit. I think web components are a good fit when you do want to encapsulate that style, that visual look and feel. When you, for example, as a design system dev, I don't want product designers having to waste time thinking about what the border radius should be for this button on this page. It's just 6. It's just 6. It's always been 6. It'll always be 6. Don't worry about it. Like, decide what kind of button it is and move on with the rest of your flow, which is way more important than agonizing over maybe this time it'll be 4, maybe tomorrow it'll be 5, but maybe on this page, like, there's just certain things, and I know that there's lots of things about that, but there are certain stylistic things that you can just sort of remove, and then you don't make config options for that. You don't make CSS variables. You don't make tokens for that. You just make a design system sort of decision and go, it's 6. It's just 6. Just don't worry about it. It's like, and you'll definitely have some people that go, no, I hate that it is 6. I need it to be 8 because reasons. And then you kind of say, okay, well, you still kind of can, or you just don't use the button component for this, and you make your own button and you make it whatever you want.
Yeah.
I definitely think there are use cases, and it depends on the quality of the style. It depends on the some of those things. Like Shoelace is a great library. Like, the functionality is awesome, but it depends on what you expect from it. If you expect to be able to make crazy buttons, you're probably not going to be able to do that, and so you're going to be unhappy. If you expect that you don't really need crazy buttons, you just kind of are all right with it being 6-pixel border radius all the time, and then, I want to just theme my color so that primary is a different one than whatever, then you're going to be smooth sailing the entire time. So I really think it's just a matter of what expectations you come in with, and if you come in from a place of framework components that all sort of resolve to regular DOM. Well, in regular DOM, we all know that you can do whatever you want to that DOM. It doesn't matter what CSS classes were on it. It doesn't matter what component it came from. You can write a big nasty selector and just be like, nope, it's a trapezoid now.
Mutation
Like,
observer and just
exactly, yeah. Just whenever that resize, whatever it is, whenever that lands in the page from now it is yellow and a square. Like I don't care what it was. Yeah?
yeah. And I
And
think this is actually like a short way of like explaining the difference between like web components and like a framework components, right? Is one is more of a if you just played this scenario, right, where it's like, hey, I want to use this button, but I want 8 pixels instead of 6 pixels, right? And that's where the one of the like diverging points kind of like going, right? So like one is more, well, it's better to do it standard, and the other is like, well, it's better to give more flexibility, right? And I
mhm,
think that's like a kind of like a general theme that like could be
sure,
applied across like a lot of the considerations across like
sure.
custom
So here's
components
the
and
unfair part, right? So and this is my conference talk that I have never written and never given. The problem is choice. Okay. If I'm the web component author for that button, and I know that you want a flexible one, a flexible button, well, I'm not going to write a prop for the border radius. I'm going to style it with a CSS custom property, and then you get to make the border radius whatever you want, right? That doesn't mean that web components are bad. If somebody writes a web component that is not configurable in the way that you want it to be, it's not that all web components and the entire web component spec are just terrible because this one library that you looked at doesn't do what you think it ought to do. It's that the author of that component designed the component to not be configurable that way, to not be flexible that way. And I think that and ultimately, if you find yourself changing so many things, so let's say you pull in a button component that is not headless. It was not marketed as headless. It has a style. It does not. It's not just a base button that's just gray that you have like that you understand going in that you have to provide all of it. If it is headful, right, whatever, instead of headless, and then you find yourself saying, I need to change the border and the hover and the outline and the radius and the font size and the padding and the this. Like, why did you use that library? Why did you pull that component in? What part of the homepage when it said all of these files come pre-baked and you said, I hate that, I'm going to install it anyway? Uh, that doesn't make any sense to me, right?
yeah,
So it's just one of those where like, and if you do that, like, don't blame it on the tech.
yeah.
Like, don't blame it on custom elements in Shadow DOM that like the author of the components didn't write it in a flexible way.
Well, I think we
Go
will
write a
still
flexible one, right?
blame
Like,
it though. I think like
sure.
it's not fair to blame them, either like authors of spec or authors of the components, but we will do still blame them. And I think that's
Of course,
the
yeah, that's a problem.
that
Yeah,
that's kind of like the uh that's why I think like Solid or React are kind of like a bit different. Again, like philosophically, they're like even further away from web components compared to like Svelte or Vue, right? Is it's much more expected for you if you see something you don't like, you just copy paste it and just edit it out like the way that you want it, right? Because a lot of the so they're going into that like more flexibility, right? Because um, uh, a lot of the like the more kind of like spec compliant things, even if you look at like Vue or Svelte, right, is like to copy paste something is a bit more involved. It's like, well, you can't just copy paste it, you have to put it in a special file. Well, you can't just like use style from here, you have to like copy it in like in a special way, right? Where like with JSX, what comes is like, well, if it looked like JSX and I copied it, it doesn't matter like again like all the file borders or like all of that stuff, it doesn't matter as much, right? It's like, well, if I copied it, if I imported all the same things as this library did, right, like that component will work in my thing, and like I don't have to like think about all the like shadow DOM borders and all that stuff. It's like, oh, when I decided to like that I like this shoelace thing, right? I want to like import it. But now, because everything inside of the namespace actually don't have the access to the namespace, it is a private class because everything is like class based, right? And it's like, and I didn't inherit the right thing. And it's like, well, I just give up, right? So like, I will probably just copy screenshot, or I copied like the exact kind of like DOM output, right? I can't kind of like reuse the source code, and it's like, well, that's where I give up, and it's like I have to kind of like rebuild everything. And again, one is more standard, and if you like standards, you should just follow the standards. But one is more flexible because when kind of like stuff happens, when like your manager says, okay, so you're telling me we can't change this 6 pixels to 8 pixels, it will take 2 weeks and like 5 people. I think we chose the wrong framework, right? So, like, that's the discussion that you will unfortunately get.
Sure. And I think like that's another one of those like those problems choice. It's all about trade-offs, because when when we all say, all of us web component advocates, when you say you can't change styles, that styles are encapsulated, that's just a shorthand for it is difficult to change styles. It is not impossible. You can absolutely do document dot query selector something dot shadow root dot query selector something dot style dot border radius equal 12. There you go. Problem solved, right? The problem with that approach is the brittleness of it. And I sort of have harped on this a bunch, is that one thing about the Shadow DOM, especially from a third-party author, is that you don't control that template. And one day, that div that you query selected for or whatever to change the border radius of just won't exist anymore. And it'll be a patch bump because it's internal templating probably. And so the author of that component will just put out a patch going restructured, refactored, div no longer exists, and then your code breaks because you went querying. But you can totally do it. You can also inject your own styles with JavaScript. You can inject it into the web components. So I think, and this is where like the difference between, say, design system components and then app components that you write yourself kind of come into play. There's also a subtle difference between libraries like Material UI and Shoelace and Bootstrap libraries that are designed to sort of be component libraries for every app on the internet, or your company's design system, which is only supposed to be your apps for your company thing. Like,
Well,
they don't
for
have
this
to be
quarter.
flexible, right? They don't have to be as flexible
Well, I'm
because they
saying
don't
like the
have
next
to be
quarter,
great.
the like design team changed, and now they want to do everything differently, right? And like what was true like a few months ago, now we have to like redo everything.
Sure, but again, that like, if you put yourself in the right frame of mind, adopting those standards makes it easy for you. So when the design team changes its mind, you just have to patch bump another package if you didn't go digging around and changing it.
Right.
And so it's all about trade-offs. It's all about the choices you make, right? You can have the flexibility, but you're going to inherit the maintenance of that code, which is no different than it's no different than any other components too. And that's why, like, to me, it's a bit unfair to give web components a bad name because of that thing, because it's just as the level of difficulty in styling a shadow root thing is the same as overwriting some class in React, right? Depending on the specificity that a React selector is, like just because it lands in normal DOM doesn't mean that the CSS selector for that isn't gnarly. You still might have to do bang important or whatever up in your app and do some crazy hacky thing to get it to be blue when it's designed to be pink. The exact same thing is true of web components. Is you still might have to do some weird document.query selector shadow root blah 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 turn board thing to get it to work. The question is it worth it? Long term, is it worth it to do that? And that's just, and again, it's just a question of choice. You can write web components that are very flexible. You can write web components with parts that you can style however you want to, that are exposed to be styling. Now, the web component spec is based on the fact that you probably aren't going to do it to every single element in that component. And so that's why we have parts and not the entire DOM tree that's stylable, but you can expose certain pieces of it. You probably, as a component author, you probably don't want to allow infinite flexibility for things that are needed for accessibility. If somebody were to put display none on something that needs to be accessibly visible text or something, that breaks the component. It breaks the whole spirit of the component. Can the developer still do it? Sure, but you don't really, you kind of want to put a little bit of a gate up sometimes in some of those things. And so it that I think that's the styling approach for is like the biggest, I think, misconception, because when you have lived framework components for years and years and years and years, and you can expect in all of those components that they just resolve to normal DOM, that you can just overwrite just however with okay, dot class, dot class, dot class, dot class. You can just repeat that same class name to get whatever specificity you need, color green. And it's just as easy as that. And there's no other options for the component author, because the component author in a React component land doesn't have shadow DOM. They don't have parts. They
Well, I
don't
think this
have,
is not
you know,
not really true, right? So I think like that's like the dot class is slightly like, like at least like 5 or 10 year old idea right now. You will probably have some sort of like tailwind override, tailwind like variant, and so on. So like the styling is done a bit differently, and more importantly, kind of like what changed, right, is that a lot of the React components, they are sharing behavior, they don't share styles. And again, like especially for React, that's true, right? And they will be like headless components, right? So like it will give you like every possible prop except for style, except for class name, and like that's kind of like you're building your own kind of like for your application. When you're building like UI components for application, you will grab the library that does behavior, you will style it as you want, and if you want a version 2 that has the different pixels, you can just copy paste the file and just change it kind of like in place. And that's what like ShadCN is based around a lot, right? It's like they don't even like abstract anything for you. They just give you the code, and it's like if you need a second drop down, it will be 99% like the same code, but it's going to be slightly different. But they're going to live in a different file. So like changes to this one, you don't have to like, yeah, you don't have to think about like all the OOP inheritance, all that stuff. It's like, well, it looked the same at first, right? But like now after few iterations, they actually don't look any more the same. So it's like, so we didn't have to take those things, abstract them away, unabstract them, and like make them different. They were different from the start, and like you don't have to kind of like worry about like all the OOP kind of like considerations for it.
sure.
So again, kind of like everyone does it
Yeah, and
differently,
it's just,
but
again, it's everyone does it differently, and I think it's because everybody does it differently. It's a bit unfair to sort of say that like web components are terrible because they're a certain way. Um, it, I, I'm not sure what other spec things kind of have that kind of approach where they're built the way they're built. The spec is what the spec is, and they go, well, that doesn't fit my use case, therefore it is awful. And it's like, it
uh-huh.
just doesn't fit your use case. It just go use something that fits your use case. It's okay. Like you don't have to like trash web components because they don't fit your use case. It's like, okay. And that's where we get back into the marketing of it, is that like, so people go back to the marketing aspect and say, well, I was told that web components would fit every use case,
Yeah,
and it doesn't fit this one, therefore I am unhappy.
yeah,
I can't vouch for that kind of stuff. I'm just sort of here to say what they are good at, and that what they're good at will sort of change over time. And that another part of it too is, again, as a design system developer, it's the flexibility aspect of it is tricky to me, because I 100% agree that flexibility is important, but if you were actually having to use that flexibility on every button on every different page that's different, that application would be absolutely horrible. It
yeah,
would be the worst thing to maintain ever when every button on every page is a different color with different bordering. Like there, at a certain point, you're like, okay, all right, all right, we had the flexibility, but we ruined it. Like, and and so I think at some point you kind of always come back to these sort of standards. And I think that meta frameworks like Remix and Next.js are evidence of that. It's that, like with just React, it was like, how do I make an app? Oh, React does not care. Well, where do I put my files? I don't know. I don't care. Then Create React app was like, we think you should do it this way. And every dev in the React ecosystem went, thank goodness I don't have to decide anymore. Like, so like flexibility is such a weird, like it's a weird amalgamous thing where like it matters when it matters and it doesn't when it doesn't. And some of it's like web components are bad because I can't make any button I want to be pink, but also please just tell me where to put my files and what to name them because I don't want to decide about app and source and blah 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 and casing. Like decide that for me. Like certain flexibility is like I have to have it, and then other flexibility is like please take it away from me. Please take away this choke. Like Next.js going like we decided on prettier. If you don't like it, suck it. Like what? And everybody's like yes, thank you. Oh, thank you. Like versus like web components are like we decided on Shadow DOM, and everybody's like how dare you? Like it's just a weird. I can't figure out. And so the flexibility argument, I think it just comes back to choice, where it's some things matter when they matter. Some things you want flexibility until it's too much. Some like it's you want standardization until you want the flexibility, and it's always just like it's just messy in the middle there. And maybe one of the reasons that web components sort of have the vitriol that they do in some spaces is that they're not in the middle. They're not very much in the middle. They definitely like picked a side, and so the people who live in the messy middle kind of are like, no, I don't like that it chose a stance. It's not the stance that I have picked today. Um, and it's just I don't know, it's just sort of weird because in other ways there are other things that pick a stance on these things that we love to argue about. Like we love to argue about file naming and structure and tabs versus spaces. Like we love a good Twitter thread about all these things, right? But then Next.js will come along and go, you have to put your files in an app folder and it has to be called route.ts or it won't work. And everybody goes, all right, cool, no complaints. And I
I
look at that and go, I don't understand you guys. I don't like you guys will complain about like like ESLint rules about like no explicit any implicit any or whatever like to, forever, and then Next.js goes it has to be called route.ts and it can't be called anything else, and you go,
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm a bit
sure.
of like old school in this terms. And it's like, yeah, I don't like Next.js. So I like the when the Create React app happened, we like packaged everything as React app, and as soon as it happened, we were like, I don't like any of this stuff though, how it's set up. So
Sure.
I'm
And then, yeah, like, but I think, but lots of people do though. I mean, it's a super, super popular
yeah,
thing, right? So, yeah, it's the the flexibility thing. There could be more options. I'll give you that point, right? There could be more ways to style it, but the thing I keep coming back to is it doesn't make web components currently bad. It makes its use case area smaller than it maybe needs to be. And I think that's how we should frame it. It's that it's not a bad tool, it's a specialized tool. Like it's just a tool. And could we make some more like add some more features to the tool to open up more use cases? Yeah, for sure. Of course, 100%. It doesn't mean it's a bad tool.
yeah. Well, and for me, I kind of like again, like I tried to kind of like get into web components. I like when Lead was introduced, I was like, yay! I like this Lead HTML part. I don't like any of this other stuff. So like that's the stuff that I like. So like when I look at web components, I can like pick and choose. It's like I don't. I'm not. Uh, I don't have this idea of like, okay, let me read a book how web components are, and this is the only thing that I'm ever going to do. And if they send me to do this, I'm going to do this. So I'm just picking the parts that I like, and like if I need Shadow DOM when I'm writing my third-party widget, I'm going to use the Shadow DOM. For everything else, you will not catch me. Right? And it's like kind of like yeah, for everything like that. Okay, so we have like a few topics that I wanted to hit. We're like
Huh?
already I think it's like a 1 hour mark. So the thing that is kind of like very uh contentious in the kind of like the web component advocates kind of like talks, right, is performance. Because on one hand, And this is the kind of like this is the things that I played with Astro, for example, right? Astro is very easy to kind of like to ship as little bytes as possible, given like, well, you need to do this, and like, how do you do it, right? And it's like, well, I could just pull in jQuery. That's going to like 40 kilobytes. I'm not going to do that, right? It's like, how do you do that? And again, I can pull in Angular, but no thanks. And if I just want a thing where you hover over your mouse and there's like a confetti flying out, right? I to use web components as just like a selector, right? As like, hey, if you see this thing with a dash in it, like add event listener, and when the event listener happens, like call this thing, right? So that was the thing that I saw from like in Astro. What is it? Dot build like the website,
Mhm.
right? I saw that in source code. I was like, okay, I understand why you're doing it. Like this makes sense to me. Why would you do jQuery selector if you're saying that like this is the thing that has a behavior, right? So on the one side, performance is very good for a small script if you're comparing to any software library, right? Like the smallest libraries out there are like 4 kilobytes. The web components are 0 kilobytes. Like if you're just using the raw class my thing extends like HTML, right? Like that's going to be the smallest thing possible, right? But on the other hand, again, this is going all the way back to like the way that the web components were sold to us, right? They were supposed to be making frameworks faster. They were supposed to be doing this thing that everyone is doing, and because it's like implemented C++, it's going to be the fastest, right? But all I hear is that like how slow web components are with their like propagation and all that stuff, and it's like, don't turn every element into a web component. Have like a kind of like a handful of them. Don't turn everything into a web component because it's like too much kind of like performance overhead, right? Like how are you kind of like looking at the performance angle, and like do you see it as a like a clear win? I've kind of like, maybe sometimes you do this, maybe sometimes you do that. Like how are you thinking about it?
Sure. I think, and like the first thing I'll say is I'm not a performance expert. Like I've literally never run a benchmark. It's just not like, and that performance is tricky in the same way that flexibility is tricky, because if if you're looking at the performance of like an upgrade path or something, then the rest of your app better be lightning fast also, and that just isn't the case for so many apps. Like the performance is one of those things that people love to have as a criticism, and then they'll have an API that takes 3 seconds to respond to get post data or something from WordPress. And so performance is definitely tricky. So like, I think we can sort of break it down. I think bundle size is one of those things where if you're comparing a single component to a single framework component, then web components just win straight up bundle size. It's just easier to just make a single thing because you don't have to download the entire framework to make it possible, right? The one of the benefits, I think it's one of the least talked about benefits of web components, is that iterative adoption path where let's say you literally just have a .html file on your server. You have an index.html and that is it. You don't even have any scripts. You have maybe you have 5 lines of CSS or something. Like you're really, really, really basic thing. You could put a web component into that HTML file and start adding little tiny pieces of interactivity in a very small way without having to adopt React or Vue or any of those things. And you could iteratively do the same thing until it got to be so much interactivity that you became an app and you stopped being a site, whatever that fuzzy definition is, right? And then maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's worth it there. You've got so many different pockets of things that are interactive now that you want to coalesce them. And so it's worth, okay, a holistic framework like a React or whatever to do those things. The iterative path for that, I think, is huge. And it's something nobody talked about. I think that's another symptom of the industry that we've got today, is that A lot of times we don't like maintain old apps. We just rewrite them from scratch, so we don't really have to worry about like slowly updating old things or static things or whatever. We just sort of write it. We just write it over again. In a lot of ways, that's good. That sort of eliminates the easiest way to eliminate old code is to trash it and start over again, right? That's totally fair. But the power of just throwing a little, like you said, your confetti. Like that's a perfect iterative example of I just want a button that does confetti. I don't need modal windows. I don't need tooltips. I don't need like React state and context. I don't need any of that stuff, right? I just want a button with some confetti. Web components would be the smallest way you could kind of do that, right? That would be reusable and I would think just a better coding practice than like jQuery, like a jQuery block, like a jQuery plugin or something like that. It's more sort of reusable, and also you could pull that third party. So let's say somebody else wrote a really good confetti button, they could write it as a web component that works literally in any app, and then you could just pull it in and put it on your page without adopting the trappings of React and Next.js and Vue and setup and options APIs and build tools and like I'm a long time dev. Build tools and things don't scare me. Like I've delved deep into Webpack, it's fine, but that's not true of everyone. There are still .html FTP sites out there, right? Anyway, there's definitely that like the idea of you could start with a very simple blog and then add a piece of functionality to it. Add a piece of it. Add a piece. Add a piece. Add a piece. Add a piece. Web components are the only thing that let you do that.
Right.
As far as I know, they're the only like component-based tool. Sure, you can just write scripts. You can inline jQuery all you want. Script tag, go to town. Query selector, do a plugin anything, right? They're the only component-based thing that I know of that lets you just put a tiny little pocket of something, and you don't have to inherit. You don't have to go read the docs of like of some some crazy thing.
Yeah, so
that's
for me,
super cool.
like when there was, I recently like watched Alex Russell's like talk when he was just like, "This is a spec that I wrote. Look at me," and the thing that he's talking about is like, I hate this class-based kind of like components, right? It's like dot card. That means that it like does this, right? Dot hide, dot I forgot fade in, right? Like he's like, I hate all of this stuff. We need to have more structure, right? Like it should mean something. It should be like a component, it should be like a button, it should be like an input, right? Like if I have a thing that does something, it should have a name. It shouldn't be just a class, right? And again, with classes, it's just like, how do you know what classes you can combine, right? It's like it's all kind of like string-based type safety. It's just like everything is a string. So it's just like, how do you know when it's not the right string? So this is definitely kind of like a thing that is um, this is definitely a thing that like kind of clicked with me. It's like, yeah, custom elements, they make sense. They are working where jQuery plugins kind of like were, but it will actually work. It will
Right.
not
Yeah.
be
Exactly. Yeah.
you have conflicting versions of jQuery and all that stuff, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And that's another huge point too. So like um, I'm not trying to talk bad about framework components and component libraries, but one of the drawbacks to them is they are dependent kind of on the major version of that framework that you're on. When React went from 16 to 17 and 18, lots and lots and lots of component libraries had to go, okay, give us like 4 months so that we can like convert to 18 because like everything's different now, right? And web component folks were just like, y'all having fun with that over there? Because we don't really do that. Like, and I think it's a good time to mention Lit, right? We can argue about whether or not Lit is a library or a framework. Call it whatever you want. I don't care. It's not worth it to argue about it, but it's a really good way to build web components. One of the ideas behind Lit, and one of the reasons that I like it so much, is that the devs and sort of the mindset behind it is to code itself out of existence. So if you think about things like the render cycle and the render like using template strings instead of JSX. Well, template strings just exist in the browser. That's not something that Lit is making. They're not creating that out of nothing. That just exists, and they're using it, and it's really cool. From a performance aspect of it, you can use a template string. So a tag template string function, right? Like HTML backtick with a string in the middle. By the browser API, splits those two things into the static parts and the dynamic parts. That's built-in virtual DOM diffing just right there. It's like tiny reactivity changes of, I know all the static parts in this string you sent me, and I know all the interpolated dynamic parts without you having to write a single line of JavaScript. Like the browser just does it, which is cool, you know? And so like performance aspect of it, it's like the upgrade cycle might be slow, but then reactive changes via something like Lit is going to be faster than a virtual DOM because A, there's no virtual DOM, and B, like they're taking advantage of things like template strings that already separate out the dynamic and the static parts for you, that you don't have to go parse it and figure it out. You know, so that ties into bundle size. That ties into like there's just so much JavaScript that goes into these things that stuff like template strings will just provide. Another spec that's being worked on through the community group is called DOM parts. It's for like templating, right? That's going to make even more power to do templating via browser link. Now, it's very early stages, but the idea would be that if DOM parts exist, then Lit just removes the stuff that it's doing for templating and uses DOM parts, which means Lit is getting smaller, right? Because Lit is doing the thing that we talked about earlier, right, is consuming the browser stuff when it gets made. The React and things, they're not necessarily, so they're getting bigger. They're not getting smaller. They could be, maybe, I don't know. But that's one of the things that I liked about Lit, is that Lit has gotten smaller. Lit is adopting standard decorators, right? Standard decorators are coming to JavaScript. They're TC39. They're coming to JavaScript. Lit already has sort of experimental support for native decorators, which means no more TypeScript decoratory stuff, no more, like none of that stuff. So all of that stuff's gonna be built in at some point too, and that comes out of Lit. To me, that's the way it should work. It should be that like the library on top of the browser is like real thin, and then decreasing every time as specs change. Right? So from the performance aspect of it, going back to that, I don't know the specifics of like the upgrade path. I would agree that like not everything needs to be a web component on the page, because again, I don't think everything on the page needs to be a component, just period. Like if you've just got like a p tag with some text in it and a global style somewhere, does that have to be ptag.tsx or whatever? Like, does that have to be a component? I think probably not. So I would just say that when people sort of use that as like a negative, like don't make your entire app out of web components, I would push back and be like, don't make your entire React app out of React components either, because you probably don't have to. You've probably got some static parts in there that aren't components themselves, right? Kind of thing
from
too.
Here, people go kind of like two ways, right? So like one of them go, well, I can use Astra, right? And I can just like use the static part like generated on the server. Similarly, some people would argue that like RC is solving that thing, because like the static parts are getting sent to you as JSON, not as JavaScript. So like it's easier to render them. Not as easy as HTML, of course, but like somewhat, right? And the third camp is like, my thing is behind like a login paid button. I will just show us like a spinner, and it's going to be fine. And like I'm working in a bigger company now, and I'm seeing a bunch of those internal tools, and the amount of time I'm looking at the spinners is not fun. So it's like that's it's like you already paid us. We don't have to give you a good experience. It's like, but I still want to get good experiences. Like the fact that you don't have to give it to me, it doesn't mean that it's nice.
Right. And I think what you're touching on is sort of like what we would say just progressive enhancement kinds of ideas of what happens on the page before all the JavaScript stuff runs. Yeah. No matter what that JavaScript is. That JavaScript could be React things, it could be Next.js things, it could be hydration of server islands, or it could be a web component, or it could be a jQuery plugin, right? The progressive enhancement idea of send as much HTML to the page via the server response as possible, and then have JS things augment and increase that, right?
Yeah.
Laudable. Like again, it's one of those choices that we all can make. We can sort of decide whether or not, like, I think we all sort of go through that at some point and say, like, JavaScript is required for my site. Turn it on and wait till it's finished, then use it, right? There's a whole bunch of progressive enhancement folks. They are also right. They are also correct, which is it should work before JavaScript. It should work on a spotty connection when that file hasn't loaded yet, where it fails. They're also correct, right? Everybody's right. And web components, again, the problem is choice. You can write web components in a progressively enhanced way. Just because you have a shadow DOM does not mean that everything has to be in it.
Well, in my case, I don't have Shadow DOM, so it makes it easier.
Well, just because it's available to you, right? It's available to you to sort of hide things, right? So, for example, let's say you just had a tag of like, x-input. That's your host element. And then, the close tag /x input. And there's no children. There's nothing inside of that. And then that's what would render in an SSR kind of process or an RSC process of like just to the browser, that's nothing. That's a span. It's a div. Like it's unrecognized, undefined tag. Just it's treated like a div, except that it's kind of not because it's a custom element and it doesn't have like intrinsic width. And there's technical things, but for all intents and purposes, it's like it's a nothing burger. It's just sitting in your page.
Yeah, better yet, display contents, right? So that like it's completely out of the DOM.
I don't. That would be a slot. I think so. I think custom elements are displayed inline by default, which is weird because we mostly want them to be blocked.
Yeah. Is that they use web components a lot for like their like the places when they interact with stuff. So, for example, if you're like booting up React, it will be booted up as a web component that's called Astor-Island. But what they do so that like they don't mess up with CSS, they will set display contents on it, so that it's just like as if your React component was a child of the component that you were putting it in. So like it like those invisible web components. And again, like that's the stuff that I was seeing, and I was like, yes, you can actually use like custom elements, and you can actually get something usable out of them, not suffering all the
all custom elements is a cool spec because basically it just means tags that HTML doesn't know about. It's really just like it's a really cool idea of, and if you think about it in this era of software engineering, of if you sent JavaScript an undefined thing, like an undefined variable or keyword or whatever, JavaScript will explode. If you send HTML an undefined tag, it goes, yeah, whatever, okay, sure, whatever, right? That's awesome. That's super cool, right? And so custom elements are just like, I can make whatever tag I want to, and then I'll tell you later what it means, or I won't. Like I've seen people that use custom elements only as like CSS selectors or something, and don't ever define them in JavaScript. You can do that too. That's kind of interesting. For the progressive enhancement kind of way of building, then like you have a choice. You can build your component so that it slots in native elements and then augments them. And so if you have like your X input or something, instead of having no children, you would have your input and your label as children. And then the web component doesn't render those. It augments those. It puts those in a div with error messages and attaches event handlers for blur and focus and puts red borders on them and stuff like that, right? That's a choice you can make, 100%. It will be there without JavaScript. You'll have an input with a label that, if your developer does it right, is accessible. That's another drawback of it, is that you can't enforce the accessibility from the component's perspective because you're relying on the developer to do it right. You can add it if it's not there, but you can't control it until the JavaScript loads, right? But when you do that, you can build on progressive enhancement. So you can absolutely do it that way. It's just the choice of the web component author as to whether or not to do it that way, right? And there's like you avoid all kinds of issues if you do it. So like the acronym, the FOUC acronym, FOUC, it's flash of unstyled content or flash of unupgraded components.
Which I learned from trying my attempts at trying to use Shoelace. I was like, oh,
sure.
This is
so Shoelace is not necessarily written in a progressive enhancement way.
Yeah.
It's like the input for Shoelace is inside the shadow root, so you won't get that until JavaScript loads and runs. There's just nothing on the page, right? The way that they style those is that you say *:* not defined, display none, and then fade it in when it's there. That's valid. It's valid. Just hide it until it's ready and then show it, right? Is it great experience? We can argue that, maybe not, right? The slotted approach for progressive enhancement might be better, but the drawback to that approach is like repeated style. Because if you want to minimize cumulative layout shift, if you want to have those inputs and labels look like your design system, your applications inputs and labels, then you've got CSS for the slotted inputs and CSS in the components or something that's repeating itself, right? Again, not perfect, but certainly doable. And so if you want a progressive enhancement kind of experience, web components can still enable that. You start reading the docs about slots and understanding what slots do and how they work. And then you can have all of the progressive enhancement that you need.
I actually prepared like a demo that I wanted to play with, but I didn't push it from my other computer, so oops. um, I think this is again we're going for a pretty like long time, and I hope we'll have like some time to play with this. This is like the demo that I played with. Unfortunately, it doesn't have everything that they've worked so hard on. But I will show kind of like my uh, I will show kind of like my approach that I've been taking with like web components so far. Yeah, so there is like a thing that I'm doing for work, and I try to make like a lighter version out of it, and now we would have to do even lighter version. Yeah, so let me know if you can like see anything that's happening on my screen, and like what's the delay is. So like if I click on the button, do you see the clicks happening and all that stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so this is like a project that they did. The idea behind this project is like um, how like if you're just like completely kind of like out of the woods, right? And you're like, what is web development? This is how I would probably kind of like guide you. And this is like not completely out of the woods. You tried PHP and jQuery before. That's the kind of like almost as good as like out of the woods, right? And it's like, hey, start with Astro because that's the kind of like the flexible one. You will kind of like not go wrong with Astro because at any point you can just like kind of like view it and do whatever, right? And the thing that I'm doing there is like the first thing that I start is of like, hey, I have like a button and you can click on it, right? And the way that I did it, I think I just like used like AI to write it. So AI, in its infinite wisdom, as soon as it saw like jQuery, right, it did a button. It gave it a class center button, which is of course that makes sense. You want a button that is on center, and then it gave it on click and all that stuff, right? So like this is what this is where we were 10 years ago when you would introduce a class that you introduced for styles and someone added a behavior on it, right?
Mhm.
Center button means a button in center. It doesn't mean you can click on it. Like why are you doing it, right? But like AI, it saw jQuery, it went right to that pattern, right?
Yeah,
And
I
then
agree.
it's like, well, let's get rid of jQuery, right? Like to make a button clickable, you can just add element, like query selector, add event listener, right? Like you don't need jQuery for that. So like that's the like completely out of the woods. Now back to the real world, right? And that's where I'm saying like you probably don't want to do class selector center button. That's like not the way that you would do it because like it doesn't make any sense, right? And I am introducing this custom element, right? And I'm like putting that functionality on it. So right now I'm like reverting back to that state. So the idea is that I'm introducing this it's called reveal button, the class, not the class, the component name,
Mhm.
right? And now to make it work, I need to import a script somewhere. Yeah, so just a script. It's .ts. That's the part. Like when you go out of the woods, you can actually use TypeScript. You don't have to. You don't have to suffer too much. Uh, and this should be script. Okay. Um, so uh, this is like intentionally bad, and it's intentionally bad exactly to show the kind of like the SSR and the progressive enhancement story, right? Like in the last step of this process, as like once I implemented it in web components, I'm re-implementing it in Solid and saying, hey, now in Solid you can do where is it? You can do client load, so it will render it in SSR and then it will like hydrate it on the client, so that you don't have any kind of like jumping UI, any like unstyled UI, any of that stuff, right? Like it's all going to be there. That's where the web is right now. Um, okay, but just to show it, right? Just to show the woods the woods part. So on the server, I'm rendering this button. That is again kind of like it doesn't do anything as a component. It's just there for functionality, but it's
Mhm.
also there for the props, right? So in this case, I'm passing a name uh, of like five cat names, which I don't know if anyone can see it. Where's the thing? Sorry. Yeah, so it's like in Astro debug mode, so it's like a bit more than than would be in production, right? But like I'm having this component and I'm sending it like just a comma separated like a list of things, right? And you can do that in React, you can do that in Astro. Like the like sending a string, comma separated string is not hard, right? Um, the things that you can do in Astro is that you can send it actually as an array, and it will like anyway, doesn't matter.
Sure, it's just stringify. Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So now going back to that script, if it will go there, yes, now it goes there, right? So no shadow DOM, no kind of like anything, right? It's just there at the bottom. And
Mhm.
when I need to talk to that button, right, I just this query select, I'm searching for a button, which is fine for like leaf elements, right? But like if I had like more children, I might have not found the right button. This is where the string based type safety kind of like comes in, right? It's like, well, I still kind of need to find a way to kind of like to say which button should trigger it, right? It's like, well, do I add an attribute? Do I add a class? Do I make it a custom component for? I already have a custom component, right? So it's like, this is like where this is where when I see all of this stuff, I'm like, this is not very maintainable, right? But you have to do that for the SSR story, right? Like if you don't have any children, of like if everything is built with your code, right? Like this is I'm referring to in this JavaScript file, I'm referring to a thing that exists in HTML, right? Like that's the serialization boundary where kind of like the information got lost, right? And that's what you get from the framework component, even like lead, right? It's a framework component that is going to say like, hey, I'm creating a button, and like this is the button, right? You have like a JavaScript like variable referring to a button, right? You don't have like just a string that you have to find for. But here you have to, and it's like once you find it, you can add on click, and on the on click, I'm just like picking one of the random names, and it's like Alonso. And this one is Billy Bailey. I don't remember where I took those, right? But like when I'm clicking on them, oh, it's from like a Dan Abramov talk. Yeah, yeah. I just like copy the screenshot. So like the names are going to be like replacing the reveal button, right? So like they are revealed. So this
Sure.
is completely client side interaction, right? And like I can just find the like this, right? I can just find this element that I'm in right now, and I can just inner text on it, right? So like this is the 0 kilobyte framework that does like this one thing,
Right. Yeah.
right? And this is the sort of stuff like how I started using kind of like elements, right? And it's like,
Hmm.
well, this makes sense for me, right? It's like I don't have to I don't have to write this reveal button 10,000 times, right? And I don't have to use jQuery to do how do you do it? I forgot how you do it in jQuery, but like you do selector, then you do dot live, right? Uh,
Yep.
yeah, the live is for events, right? The problem is that like when I do this, like I still need to find like the current element, right? So I think there is like a way if you do something like this, it will give you the current element. Like instead of this, I think you do the yeah, I don't remember anymore. But like this is the sort of stuff is like how do you do all those things that like web components already do for you, right?
Sure.
When I'm looking at this, I'm seeing this is where I'm saying what functionality is. This is me referring to the element. And all of this makes sense. And all of this makes sense in a very kind of like server first, HTMX, and I'm wearing the wrong hoodie, right? But like I'm just adding like a bit of interactivity on the thing that like server produced, right? And like HTMX way would be on this on click, you do fetch, you get you get text, right? And you await on it. And when the text is done, you just like set it to the thing, right? Like
Hmm.
this would be like the HTMX way, right? And it's
Sure.
like,
Yeah.
well, all of this can like make sense. So kind of like the thing that I'm asking you is like, why would I from here go to kind of like more web components instead of going to solid, right? Like I did in this thing where well, I guess that's like the easiest way. Let me undo the HTMX thing. So if I just stash, right? Like now I'm in the solid land. The name of the thing that was where is it? Like reveal one of the like the end cats, right? Like this is the same button SSR, this is the same button client side. If I go back to web components, right, when I'm refreshing, I didn't like calculate that client side data yet, right? Like it's based on the attribute. I don't have the access to the attribute yet and all that stuff. Or I have to like duplicate the same logic, right? Like I have to calculate this thing on the server and then on the client and maybe like calculate it and put in a template, right? But then I have to find a template again based on strings, based on just like where it is in the DOM, and it's like, what if someone changes it? What is my contract between like server and client and all that stuff, right? It's like, well, I know the thing that solves it, right? And like if we are talking about lead, right? It's like, well, solid is the same kind of like bundle size as lead. Like, why would I do the the platform thing, right, instead of the like the easy thing?
Well, so I think my answer is that like what you're sort of describing here is that you want to make a framework component in a framework. It's that totally makes sense, and I wouldn't talk you out of doing that.
Mhm.
There are some differences, right? So one is that you have a build and compile step in Solid that is forced on you. You have to. The reason that it can be SSR'd like that is that it is a build and compile step that has to run first, and Solid puts all of its components through that thing, right?
Mhm.
Web components don't. So if you were writing this component to go anywhere, then you couldn't use Solid to do that. So that's one. That's one thing.
Well,
The
define
reason that
anywhere.
Solid is a choice for you is because it's only a component in this app.
Like I couldn't put it on an npm. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, if well, you could, but it would only work in Solid apps. If it were a
Uh,
solid component, it would only work in Solid apps, right? Which is
sure.
fine.
Okay.
And so
Well,
basically,
if
it's
it's a
like
lead
so what we're
component,
talking about
uh
is a framework kind of component, right? We're talking about a component designed for your app. It's not designed to be third party. It's first party. It's you writing a component for yourself,
well,
right?
okay. So let's. let's talk through this. So I have like a previous step, right? Well, I guess like this is the previous step, right? So like I have this thing, right?
Hmm.
And I'm saying, well, because you're using this feature, right? Because you added this thing, you can just like remove this thing. Well, now everything fixed, right? Like now everything is good. Like I intentionally like broke it, right? So now I click on it, it works. Like everything was fine. But like once I started doing this thing, once I started doing the maybe like Shadow DOM, like all the like Flash event style components, all of that stuff, right? That's where I would say like, hey, give up and use the framework component, right? So here you could argue, right? Is like, well, maybe use lit uh, instead of solid, right? Lit also has SSR step, right? And it's like, but it's more standard. And I'm saying, well, solid is as standard as lit, right? Like they both have framework components that have SSR step that's like the browsers don't know about,
Sure.
right?
Right. I think so. SSR is. We were always going to get to the SSR topic, right? It was always coming. It's a web
We knew
component chat. We were
it.
always going to talk about SSR, right? Here's my main point. SSR, I think, is the right thing to do. I think it is the right approach to take for writing web apps. You want to minimize client-side JavaScript. That's no one can argue that that's not a good thing. That's totally a good thing. The hard part about it for web components is that I don't know that web components can have an SSR spec. Right? As we talked about this, I talked about this on Twitter a little bit. Solid has both a server and a client
And
itself.
the build step.
It makes its own server and client and build step, right? Safari does not. Safari is only the client. And so the argument that always comes back to is that web components don't have SSR ability. You're right. They don't. Whose job is to make that? How do you do that? Do you go to Safari developers and go, tell Express that they have to be able to render a web component? And Safari developers go, no, what? We don't do servers, right? So I think the hard part is that everything that has an SSR has a server that they own, that they control, that they custom write. Next.js has one. It's Express. Astro has one. Like everybody, all of these frameworks that have done the only reason that they can pull off SSR is that they control the server. They write one, they create one, right? All of the components that are in that are designed to exist in the ecosystem in which the server is present. Web components don't have a server. Nobody writing web component specs and deciding about web components has anything to do with any servers,
Well, I
right? And so the
can.
question is like,
Yeah.
so let's say you're right.
Uh-huh.
We all want web components to be SSRable, right? We all want native web components to be able to be rendered on the server. There is no spec path to defining that from a spec perspective. How do we
Well,
do that?
okay.
Who,
So
who,
so
who do we talk to?
I uh-huh. I have like kind of like the takeaway that I take from this, right? Is like, well, you should probably start with web components and kind of like do again like not web components. Probably like the right term is like custom elements, right? Like should probably start with custom elements and kind of like see how long it will take you because like the kind of like the zero bundle benefit, the kind of like the undying nature of web is like all those things that will like if you're just doing like hide me if I click on it, just do it as like simplest thing possible because that simple thing will work in 15 years, not in 15 months, right? Until the next version of something, right?
If you're already in a solid app though, then you're already not purely on those things. You're already
Right,
in build
right. But
step
like
land, right?
I'm
So the solid thing might be the simple thing,
yeah, yeah.
right?
I'm just saying, like here, like when I'm here, this is like everything works, and like it will work for 15 years, right? Like I have just one on click, and just like it will work, right? And I don't have Shadow DOM, so I don't have to worry about. Okay, my sound like changed a bit. But are you hearing me? Okay.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I'm hearing you. Okay, yeah, it
Okay.
did change.
um, so um, so I'm not using Shadow DOM. I don't have to worry about like all the other things, right? Like declarative Shadow DOM. Like, what if the spec changes? Like, it's like I don't have to do that, right? Like, until I'm doing this thing, it's all fine. And there is probably a way for you to kind of like to get through this kind of like somewhat, right? It's like, well, maybe add a fade in as shoelace does, right? Maybe use it for things that are below default and like you won't see the like the loading state or whatnot. Maybe like add like a real spinner for it, and so like there are things that you can like do, right? But the more that I look into it, the like this thing where it's this simple, you should probably do it as a web component because that will just work.
Maybe. And
And
so I do
uh-huh,
want to point out this one thing I think is a little bit unfair about this example, right? And it's only a tiny bit, right? One thing is on the web component example, on the or I'll call this HTML, like HTML components. So I think that's what what the industry's been calling them,
interesting.
which is
Okay.
basically a custom element with a class with no shadow DOM. Sure, fine. You put the button as a child, but in the solid example, the button is in the component. It isn't a child. And so when you say, I have to go find the button, then I have to use a string, and what if it's deeply nested? If you put the button as a children to the solid component, you'd have the same problem there too. You'd have the exact same code, but the difference is that you put your button inside of the solid component, which would be where shadow root goes,
Uh-huh.
right? That would be your shadow root. So solid in this case is your shadow root because you have encapsulated state and all
Yeah.
those things. That's the stuff that shadow root would provide you. The trade-off is Fook. The trade-off is waiting
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
JavaScript because you don't have a server. There is no server, right? And so they're not necessarily apples to apples, right?
Yeah.
And and how much that matters just really depends on the type of app that you have. If you're in a spa, if you're in a spa app, who cares about SSR?
Uh-huh.
You're in a spa app. Your whole app does not load until JavaScript is ready. Therefore, web components are fine for you, right? They're fine for you, kind of thing. If you're not, if you're in a sort of more modern stack that's multi-page and it's more SSR, then it may also depend on the kind of component. And so this is another nuanced take that I've got, that it depends on the kind of component whether or not SSR is important. So for example, take a modal window component or a tooltip component, not the button that triggers it, the
Yeah. Yeah.
tooltip itself. What does it matter if that tooltip loads in via the server? The button can be native and come from the server. The click on that is client side all day long. The tooltip itself isn't even rendered by default, so it doesn't show on the page. So it won't be like taking down your Lighthouse scores, and it won't be impacting your CLS and all that kind of stuff. But so if you defer that script or whatever, and you just load it asynchronously, and then it shows up in a minute, it's not going to be affecting your page, but you still get the tooltip, right? So like I feel like there are certain classes of components that SSR just isn't relevant for
Right.
because they're client ones all day long. Modals, drawers, accordions, tooltips, all these manner of like hide show a thing, right? If you're doing the web component for like layout, like make this a flexbox thing. Maybe not, right? If you're doing it for text, to say like, you know, property color equal red or whatever, maybe not. It depends on the everything else in your app, all the other principles that you have, all the other things, right? The Are you slotting in a p tag, or is the p tag in the shadow root and you're fading it in when it's defined, right? All of those things, they're all trade-offs. Um, it's one of those things where like there is nuance here, and so I think you, like you said, building up to it is also a good thing. But then I think there's a certain class of components that are just web components all day long. They're client components all day long, and the SSR argument just like goes out the window, right? Like anything that doesn't show by default that has to be shown on the click, any of those things, right, are for me are like they're not even going to be server components in like Next.js. They're still going to be client components. You still need the JS to put the click listener on it, to hide and show the thing, right? You to change the class name on it, all that stuff, right? Does it really matter if the div for that is already on the page, hidden at the bottom of your body tag, like in the request? maybe not, right? Maybe it does. Maybe it does. Maybe to some folks, like the modal window on the page also has to be already on the page and hidden or something via SSR.
Yeah, and
I think maybe not.
yeah,
Right?
and in terms of spec, this is kind of like going kind of like all the way back to like to the a bit of like, are you going the standards way or are you going to like the flexibility way, right? So what I think is like the biggest kind of like difference, right, between like frameworks and like web components is that when they had an opportunity, right? So, for example, a recent change, right? React Server Components. React Server Components are so like new. There is like one thing that can do it, right? Or maybe two now with Redwood, right? Like it's not like can I make it across all the browsers? It's like you can't even make it across all the servers, right? It's like it's such a like a
Yep.
new thing that but they decided that like all the benefits that they see there are worth it and they will do that even though it's not standard, even though it's like it will not work with like this component anymore, it will not work with this version anymore, right? Like they had a
Mm-hmm.
choice, and in that choice between standard and doing it they decided to do it right? And this is kind of like what lead is doing right now with SSR, right? It's like they're like, well, there's going to be lead SSR. We can't do web components SSR, right? We are going to do lead SSR because
Mm-hmm.
that's the thing that we can do as
That's
opposed
the
to the
only thing you can
standard
do. Yeah,
thing.
exactly. Yeah, and that's what I say. And that's why I go back to is like it, it, it probably can't be a spec. That's just my idea. Is that who makes the spec? There are no W3C specs for Express, are there? Like I don't know. Like there might be some. I don't know what when you talk about like the working groups that are involved with like CSS. Like there's no you have to do CSS this way on the server. There's
I can actually
not
argue for like how I would have done it, and I think it's
maybe
possible,
but like they all come out of what's on the browser, right? So
right?
that by definition there's no server involved, and so it's all of these things. Like when people make servers, they're in charge of whether or not they want to support that, and so by extension, libraries that work on those servers or are designed to run on those servers. So the SSR story for web components is going to be complicated because it is probably going to be up to the frameworks to figure it out. So Lit has an SSR version for them. Enhance has an SSR version for their components. Like Fast maybe has, I think Fast has an SSR version for them because they know how their components work. They know their API, they know their rendering logic, they know all that stuff. Express doesn't know anything about any of it. Express has no idea what any of that is, right?
Right,
Next.js had to write an Express server to do Next.js stuff
right.
because it knows Next.js's stuff. So if anybody could figure out how to render a web component in Next.js, it's Next.js.
Yeah.
It's
So I
it's
think
that core team, right?
yeah. So I think the like the thing that you mentioned, right, is like where I have this thing, right, and with components I had this thing, right. So like here the button was inside of this component, right, like inside of shadow root,
Mm-hmm.
and here the component was like the just the child of this thing. I think that like when I thinking about web component SSR, I'm thinking about custom element SSR, right? Like I'm not thinking about kind of like shadow root. It's kind of like not my concern. Like I don't know why people like shadow root, right? But it's like when I'm seeing this, what is missing in like custom element spec right now is a way to hydrate it, right? Like if I already gave you this button, make sure that it's the same button when like when I insert HTML, right? Or because like the thing that I'm doing here, right, is like I'm doing this, right? Like I'm taking I'm taking an element and I'm saying like here's your new value, right? But like we already have spec for that. It's called view transition, right? I can say, hey, here's the snapshot before it was for SSR output, no shadow, no, like I'm skipping all of that stuff, right? Like here's what server sent to you, here is what I attempted to do client side to exactly like one-to-one match it and basically like hydrate using this client data on top of this server data, right? And like we have, I forgot how it's called, but like so right now it's kind of like under the like the view transition kind of like thing, right? But
Hmm.
there's API that allows you to say like, hey, this iframe, like save all the state, don't touch anything, right? Like I'm going to move it here, or like I'm going to navigate to another page, but like this section of the page should be the same, like should stay kind of like should
Yeah.
preserve the state, like not be updated. So I think it's going to be along those lines that we already almost have everything running, and it's like I can see that being a spec, and I can see that happening. Shadowroot, again, those are the crazy people. I don't understand how that works.
Every web code I've ever written has been Shadowroot, and it's all been fine. Um, again, the only thing that you have to do is wait till JavaScript is loaded. That's and it's interesting because we go back to performance, right? Performance is such a weird topic because you have to get to things like slow speeds, right? So you basically get into progressive enhancement type things. If you're on a decently fast internet connection, a human could not interact with something before the JavaScript is loaded. Like it
Wow,
probably could not happen. It probably can't happen,
I think
right?
that's not
Now,
true.
uh, well, again, decently fast speeds, right? It depends on page load, but the like, yes, they're on people of all different kinds of things, and that's a progressive enhancement discussion of that things on the web should work for everyone on every speed, in every on every type of phone and every type of device. Like they're all correct. You're all correct. That's how it should happen. But we have those trade offs all the time. Like every company in the world has browser support requirements, and I don't care that you're on IE6. Goodbye. It costs too much time and effort, right? So it could also be one of those things where it becomes one of those like financial scope levers to say like we just can't support people on 3G connections or whatever. Like yeah, anyway, I'm not saying that the progressive enhancement folks are incorrect. They're not. They totally have the right idea. The If you're just doing like no shadow root type stuff, then you don't really need to hydrate because the connected callback is your hydration, right? Like that's client side, and you don't need solid to fill in the props. You need solid to put the attributes on the tag, but you can do that server side. They don't mean anything until the client side stuff runs, but they're there. They're in the string that is in the response or whatever. Um, and so I think if you're just doing, if you're not doing sort of a deep rendering type thing, which means you don't have shadow root, then I'm not sure that hydration is much of a concern because the props that you got from the server are the only things that it could possibly have, right? It couldn't have different props somehow. I guess maybe it could if you hydrated a parent component or something, but and then it somehow changed state. But I think every hydration thing I've seen warns against that to say like you've got different state in your app and that's a problem or something. So I don't think they really want you to have a different state from the on the client than you have from the server. So if you're just doing custom elements with no shadow root like that, that just lands client side, you probably don't need any hydration stuff. Connected callback is probably enough. That's your hydration step to just say, where am I when I run? Like I got connected to the DOM. What happened? Where are we at? And that's where you do your query selector because you don't know. You just don't know where in the DOM. You don't know what the child is, so you have to figure it out.
Yeah, well, the way that I can like look at it, right, is like when I have this sort of thing, right, when I have a piece of logic that will be updated when like the data changes, right? So like if I send different props here, like and if I expect like this 5 to turn to 4 and so on, right? Like I can do that in Solid, and I had then my demo that does that for web components as well. Unfortunately, that's like on
Mm-hmm.
the computer, right? But like I can make this I can make this listen props, and I can like rerun this logic like on the like button title. I can rerun it, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I can rerun it client side. But when I need this logic as well on the server side, that's where it kind of like becomes problematic, right? So like this in
Sure.
this case, I'm just giving up on that consistency, right? And I'm like saying, well, I don't want to implement it twice. I implemented it once, which means kind of like which means like broken hydration, right? Which means uh,
Sure. And I think we're also getting those like isomorphic code is like the toughest code to write.
Yeah.
It's just the hardest thing. Um, my personal opinion on that is that it might be a wild goose chase to write something that works on the server and the client. They're just different environments. They're literally different environments, right?
Well, we've
You
been doing
can't.
it for 10 years, so it's not that crazy.
I guess it depends on what it is,
Or
right? If it's a
20
fetch,
depends how it
if it's a
counts.
fetch, okay, that's gonna work. That's gonna work the same. If it's a DOM attribute, if it's like a set attribute or something, you've got to shim the DOM for that to work, right? So you're sort of faking the environment, right? Um, I don't know. I tend to think that like you could probably just structure your code a little bit differently and end up with something like hooks, but not hooks. Like you just have a helper function that does the logic that is in both places and it gets passed to both places, and then your client side just calls the function rather than it being baked into the component. Those patterns have existed for a long time, and I don't necessarily think they're bad either. I don't know, like I guess Solid would have to pass that function to the client from the server or something too. I'm not. I guess there would be like I don't know what Solid calls those or whatever. Um, Probably something weird like client actions or something like that. Whatever. Um, but I don't necessarily think that that's bad either because it's all about what are you encapsulating. So, for example, hooks are encapsulating logic separate from style and template. They're literally, it's just logic. That would be the same thing. It would be like this the idea of having a helper function that only does the fetch and then returns the data. That's encapsulating logic. It's the same idea that is independent from template and style kind of deal. Right? You could achieve the same thing. I think it would just be helper functions, not hooks or whatever. It wouldn't be like you could probably build an app without like reactivity from hooks and it would probably be just fine. It would just be like set state equals output of helper function rather than like the set state is in the hook or whatever, you know? And I don't know, I don't really have a well-formed opinion about whether or not that's good, that that logic itself is encapsulatable all the time. Like it feels like that's also a thing that just there's nuance there, you know? Like if it's I have a hook for a random number and then I set a state. Like it depends on so many different things. It depends on setting the state and the reactivity and the entire framework around it to make that set state possible for whatever component you happen to put this hook in, you know, that kind of thing. Versus just a helper function that goes, here's your random number. I don't care what you do with it. I just return. I don't care. It feels like the helper function things that don't have the encapsulated state setting and reactivity feel more portable. But it depends on your definition of portability. Again, we're talking about cross app, cross environment, cross. You know, if you want to port that logic from a solid app to a view app, it can't have reactivity in it. It has to just be default fetchings of things, right? It can't have reactivity. You just have to return a value. So I guess it depends on what level of portability you're after. If it's portability within the same app or the same kinds of apps, then do the solid thing. Do whatever solid hooks are. That's fine. If it's portability across those apps, and it's logic only, then you're in like helper function territory. Like it's just helper function type stuff.
Uh-huh. Have you ever like heard or tried XSLT?
I have heard of it. Yes, I think some of the web component community group folks have talked about
Okay. Well,
SSLT. Yeah,
like the short version of it is that imagine your whole like React app, but it's written as XML. So it's like, hey, find like button here, and if it's clicked, show this. And so it's basically like it's like a programming language, but it's declarative. So as soon as you like downloaded the XSLT, it's just there. So it's in a sense, right? It's like, well, I can just use JavaScript for that. But like the benefit is that like when you can just like output it from PHP, right? And just like it just like all works.
sure.
Well, worked for a while. But like the declarative kind of like thing, right? Is like That's a lot of like the kind of like the thinking behind I guess like Angular initially, but now it's like probably Vue, right? Is like on that thing, maybe like Knockout, right? It's like you just write HTML. That's the only output that you have, right? And it's like everything that kind of like is going to happen with it, you just like kind of like declare it, right? And now
Yeah.
I think this like Facet framework kind of like was showing up recently. It's like, hey, observe name and title, right? And if it changes,
Right.
kind of like do this, and it's kind of like similar to Enhance, I think, right? I don't remember
Yeah.
the
So I
exact.
think there's good news on that front too. So from the Web Components community group, declarative custom elements are talked about a lot, and there's lots of different ways to do it. And so I definitely think you'll see something like that come to browsers in the near future, spec future. So like 5, 6 years, right? Like not framework future of like in Canary tomorrow.
Yeah,
Any of that.
maybe Apollo
But
feel like we're lucky.
it's yeah, for sure. It's talked about a lot, and I think where the discussions right now are standing on is that there probably need to be some underlying things first. One of the ones that I think has gotten a lot of attention is HTML modules, that you can import an HTML file like you would import an ES6 module. There's probably an explainer out there somewhere. Yeah, HTML modules explainer, that's the one. Yep. And what you'd be able to do is import with a type assertion, and
Hmm.
what you would get is an HTML fragment, like a document fragment.
Uh-huh.
And then as this relates to custom elements, like is the module.html example, is that could have an inline script in it that defines the element. And you just have completely declarative, you know, but syntax and everything with just an HTML module, and the only JavaScript you had was to import it. That was your only JavaScript, and everything else is just the browser just takes over and hydrates all of those things. I think declarative shadow DOM is a step in that direction as well. That declarative shadow DOM is sort of meant to be an output from an SSR type function that
Hmm.
will turn a deeply rendered template into something that the browser can understand and turn back into a dynamic hydrated component. There are some problems with that too. Like we've got to figure out styles because you have to repeat styles right now. But there's work on like open stylable would be one of those ways that helps with some of those things. There's also type assertions with CSS modules, so you could just import a CSS module and
Uh-huh.
not repeat the actual CSS, like some of that stuff. The browser would already do pretty good at caching that CSS even for DSD. So I think it's like all the things you want are coming. They're just going to take too long.
Yeah.
They're going to you wanted them, you wanted them 2 years ago, and they're just being talked about now. So like opening up the styling discussion for Shadow DOM and like letting some styles in and improving the style story. It's being talked about. Please, anybody watching this forever, join the Web Components community group Discord and come talk about it and get your use cases and help push those specs forward. That's how it works, right? You absolutely can take part and help drive these things and help show the people who literally writes web components code for Safari, Firefox, and Chrome, right, and Edge, um, what to do and how to do it and what makes sense and why. And so that's coming. Like HTML modules will probably be coming. Template languages will probably be coming. Something that helps doing declarative custom elements will probably come. There's lots of interest in those kinds of things. It's a long road to figuring out what it actually looks like and the shape of the spec because it has to exist forever. Once it lands, it's going to be there for absolutely till the end of time. So they take their time and get it right. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, like, a bit like you were saying, like, well, everything that you want, for me, isn't like everything that like Lead wants, right? As you were saying, like Lead wants to be smaller. They want to like offload features to kind of like the platform. It's like, well, Lead wants to have like a declarative shadow job. Lead wants to have like this or that, right? But like as I was saying, there are like a smaller frameworks that do kind of like follow a bit like what kind of like the platform, right, or the like what Lead is doing, and they're using the same things, but right, but like big frameworks, they don't care about that. Like it's like
Hmm.
it's not changing kind of like any of their calculations in terms of like what features they want to do or something like that, right? But for bigger frameworks, the thing that is used is like web components as just like a spec to like to render each other, right? Like instead of like, well, this is a React component, this is a solid component. I don't know how to like, how do I render it? How do I hydrate it? Where do I like
Yeah,
pull in all the hydration
sure.
scripts? I will just render it as a HTML. I will just serialize my stuff to string, right? Like, and then I don't have to kind of like worry about it.
Yeah, and I think like your point about big frameworks like adopting or choosing not to adopt, it's one of those like chicken and egg problems. Is should they have done it first and like help push the spec along, or should they only change and restructure after usage of these things gets high enough for them to notice, right? And so it's one of those things where like I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know what it's going to take for like React to adopt this thing, and I have no idea. That you can see it start to change. There has been enough noise about them just supporting regular old custom elements in React and JSX that React 19 is going to fix some things and change some things when it comes out,
Well, it's
right?
not the
So
same.
it's
It's
not
more
the same
along the lines that I was just saying, right? It's like
for
they
sure,
will allow
but
you
it
to
is
render.
more evidence of them sort of caring about custom elements just in general, right?
I don't
It's
care.
not. You don't think so?
I feel like I feel like it was like one of the things, right? That was like, hey, we will see kind of like once RxJS is in browser, once or signals are in browser, once web components are browser, every framework will see their wrong ways and will just write on top of it. But I don't see that happening. So, for example, it's like, yes, Lead is using like all the APIs that are added, right? But like, like not big frameworks, right? And it's like, well, Angular maybe will be using the browser signals, but like not right away, right? Like they will still have to have a polyfill and all that stuff. And it's like, who knows if they will have some SSR requirements or like whatnot, and like they will have to give up on the standard that they are building themselves, right? So it's like I don't see uh again, like unless you're Google, maybe if you're Google, maybe then you use the like the spec, right? But if you're not Google, you don't care about that. It's like it's not going to work out for you.
Right, and I think we go back to sort of the server discussion, right? It's that it in order for React to adopt web components on the server during their server build process, right? Their Node.js right build process that's these days kind of required. Like, yeah, you can still put a React.js just a rendering part of it in a CDN and a script tag, but no one does that anymore, right? Everyone builds it from Node.js these days, right? So the build process is kind of like the way they're going, right? Especially with RSDs and all of that, like their build process is just happening. In order for them to adopt it, they'd have to figure out a way to write web components on the server. So we're right back to whose responsibility is it to figure out how to SSR a web component? It's always been the framework. It's the same job no matter what. If they were going to adopt it, right? And so it becomes a would you just rather write your own thing that where you can just make up your own rules and it obeys your own principles and do that, or would you rather take the time and effort to make a spec and write a spec for other people to follow? I don't know what the right answer is, but I understand why they don't. Right? I understand why it's just easier to be like, my thing, my rules, my server, my thing, yeah, my thing. It's fine, right? I don't care what Vue's doing. Whatever Vue's doing, Vue stuff. Like makes total sense. So the server side problem of web components is just a humongous problem because there's no one in charge. There's no one to talk to. There's nobody. There's nobody that owns it, right? And like even the runtimes, I don't think have a role because it's somewhere in the middle because the servers that do it are not the runtimes themselves. So you couldn't go to Node.js technical steering committee and be like, hey, think about web components, right?
Or Python
Um,
or Rust, right? Like
right,
there
yeah,
are more
you couldn't go to
servers.
Bun and be like, hey Bun, do web things. They'll be like, no, I don't care, right? They're like, that kind of thing. And so there's just no one to talk to. There's literally nobody to be like, hey, I have a spec for you because it just doesn't work. And so like I think web components in server land is going to take a while because it's going to be up to frameworks to do it. It's always been up to frameworks to do it. Like thus far, it will be. And frameworks, the big ones, don't really have a reason. They don't really have a catalyst, and it doesn't really benefit them that much to do it. You know, so I think, it's an interesting shift because, again, and maybe another problem with like the web component adoption is that web components became usable right as we were like about to shift back to doing more stuff on the server.
Yeah.
Like it was like, hey guys, we've been spas for like 12 years, and web components were like, sweet, that's awesome. And then like web components were like, we're ready, and spas are like, yeah, never mind, and screw it, back to the server. Like it's another one of those things where like, if we were all still throwing boatloads of JavaScript to the client and loading it, web components would be fine. They'd be great. But now everybody's like, hey, servers, go back to the servers. They're doing on the servers. And then within a year of that happening, within a year of React going, hey, we can make server components, it's been but what about SSR? Even when I don't even know what the data is on how many SSR apps there actually are in the world compared to how many spas there are in the world, I bet there's still more spas. I would bet that there are still more single page apps that web components are perfect for and fine with and integrate with just fine, right? More so than there are SSR apps where there are difficulties. And so the problem of web component SSR is a big one. I don't know if there's any way to even solve it because there's no one to petition. There's no standards body for, servers, of which there are 100.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do it.
Okay, we're like way out of time. Let's end it here. I think, like, again, I'm like checking all this stuff. I'm seeing kind of like every few years how is it going. I think it's going better and better. So like, I think eventually the real world and spec world will meet. Maybe the like one just have to chase another. Maybe the other one will like look back into web components, or like another cycle. We will soon all be doing like local first JavaScript only, like on your machine things, and like who knows?
Yeah,
Maybe
who
that's
knows? Who knows? Yeah, who knows? It was a great chat. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk about these things. Always fun to at least. And again, I hope I hope that you'll still give them a shot because I do think they have a place. It's the key is all about the trade-offs. It's all about the choices. It's all about just exactly what you want to do for your app the way you want to do it. And it may not work. My only ask is if it doesn't work for your use case, don't slam the whole tech. don't slam the entire tech because it isn't just what you need for your app right here, right now. The tech is still good tech. It's still awesome, and it'll be around for a long time and keep improving.
Yeah, sounds great. And I will be leaving the link to the web components Discord. So if anyone has like any ideas, feel free to,
Yes,
I don't know, like
please come. We are very wide open. We are a community group, not a working group, so we are not shut off to the public. We want more people to come in. Would love more than just the 6 of us that show up to the meetings to help push these specs along. It'd be great. The more the merrier.
Yeah, yeah, and thank you for your time. It was nice to kind of like, again, like see real people using this thing, having good time, and thinking of like how to make more people happy.
Awesome. I
Okay,
appreciate it.
yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. Take it easy.